The words landed like a bullet Rose Hawthorne had not known she was waiting to receive. She stood in the doorway of the Sweetwater sheriff's office, her hands trembling against the frame, the late afternoon sun burning copper across the floorboards. The town outside was alive with the ordinary sounds of 1884 wagon wheels grinding through packed earth, the distant call of a livestock auctioneer, the laughter of children chasing a dog down the main street. But inside this small, wood-paneled room that smelled of pine resin and old leather, the world had stopped entirely. Milton Lockhart sat behind his desk, his broad shoulders curved slightly forward, his hat removed and placed beside the inkwell as though he had wanted nothing between them in this moment. His dark eyes were steady, unflinching, and yet there was something raw in them, something that cracked the composed surface of the most respected lawman in Garnett County, New Mexico Territory, wide open. He had said it softly. That was what undid her most. Not the confession itself, though that was staggering enough to make her knees go weak, but the tenderness in his voice, the quiet certainty. The way the words had arrived without apology, but with such profound care that they bypassed every defense she had carefully constructed over the past 8 months. "Every report I filed," Milton said again, his voice barely above a murmur, "left your name out, because I believed you from the start, Rose." Rose Hawthorne felt the back of her throat tighten with something she had forbidden herself to feel since the night Daniel Voss had burned her life to the ground. Betrayal. Trust. The terrifying possibility that someone in this world had seen her clearly and chosen to stand beside her anyway. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins at the back, and strands of it fell against her cheek. She was dressed plainly, as she always was, a gray cotton skirt, a faded green blouse that had once been the color of river sage, because her wardrobe, like everything else she owned, had been rebuilt from almost nothing after the fire, after the accusations, after the trial that had never quite happened but had proceeded in the court of public opinion with devastating efficiency. "You could have lost your badge," she said. Her voice was hoarse. "If anyone found out you were protecting me, I was not protecting you." Milton's jaw set with a quiet intensity that she had come to recognize over these long months. "I was recording the truth. Your name had no business being in those reports because you had no hand in what Voss did. That is not protection. That is accuracy." Rose pressed her hand flat against the doorframe, needing the solidity of it, because she had spent 8 months believing that everyone in Sweetwater thought the worst of her. That the whispers she heard when she walked into the general store, the silence that fell in the church vestibule, the careful distance kept by women who had once been her neighbors, that all of it was the consensus of the world about who she was. And Milton Lockhart had known the truth from the very beginning, had guarded it like something sacred, while the rest of the town built its judgment around a lie. The question was how this had come to be. And to understand that, you had to go back to the beginning of it all, to a raw January morning 8 months earlier, when Rose Hawthorne had arrived in Sweetwater with nothing but a carpetbag, a sealed letter of recommendation from a judge in Santa Fe, and a secret she had not yet decided whether she could survive. She had come to Sweetwater in the winter of 1884, under circumstances that she would not have chosen for herself in any previous version of her life. Rose had grown up in Taos, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died of fever when Rose was 11, leaving behind a garden of dried lavender and a trunk full of books that Rose had read until the covers fell off. She had been educated beyond what was common for women of her station, could calculate figures with unusual precision, and had a memory for legal language that had served her well when she worked as a clerk for the land registry office in Santa Fe at the age of 22. That was where she had met Daniel Voss. He had arrived in the registry office on a Tuesday with a stack of property transfer documents and a smile that could make a woman forget to verify the dates. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, not warm exactly, but magnetic, with a talent for making whoever he was speaking to feel like the only person in the room. He had asked Rose to assist him in filing 3 separate parcels of land, had thanked her with particular attention, and had returned the following week with more documents and a bunch of wildflowers tied with twine that he set on her desk, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Rose, who was 24 by then and had spent the better part of 2 years surrounded by ledgers and property maps, had been susceptible in ways she would later find embarrassing to recall. She had not been naive. She had simply been lonely in the specific way that intelligent women in small professional roles often become lonely when the work is satisfying, but the life surrounding it is thin. She and Voss had conducted a courtship over 3 months. He had told her he was a cattle broker from Albuquerque, that he had interests in several ranches throughout the territory, and that he was a widower. She had verified none of this, which was the first mistake. The second was agreeing to marry him in May of 1883 at a small ceremony attended by 6 people, none of whom Rose knew well. The third mistake was trusting him with her access codes to the registry archive. She had not given them willingly. She had not even known at first that they were gone. Voss had been careful, extraordinarily careful, and it was not until October of 1883 that a federal land inspector named Cartwright arrived in Santa Fe and began asking questions about a series of fraudulent property transfers that had rerouted nearly 400 acres of legally deeded Apache reservation land into private hands under forged registry stamps. The investigation moved with the speed that federal investigations rarely achieve, and within 3 weeks Voss had vanished and Rose had been left standing in the registry office holding papers she had never touched with a set of forgeries bearing her registry seal number. She had been questioned for 6 days. She had told the truth in full on the first day and had kept telling it in every subsequent interview. The federal inspector had believed her perhaps halfway. The registry director had not believed her at all. And the town of Santa Fe, which had watched her marry a man who turned out to be a land fraudster and forger, drew its own conclusions in the comfortable way that towns always do when a story is simpler than the truth. The charges had never been formally filed against Rose. There had been insufficient direct evidence. She was a clerk, not a property holder, and her financial records showed no unexplained income. But insufficient evidence is not the same as exoneration, and insufficient evidence leaves a kind of permanent shadow that follows a person down every road they try to walk afterward. The judge in Santa Fe, a man named Hargrove who had known Rose's father and who had watched the investigation closely enough to form his own opinion, had written the letter of recommendation himself. He had addressed it to the territorial sheriff's office and to any establishment in Sweetwater willing to employ a woman of demonstrated competence in clerical and administrative work. Sweetwater had a new schoolhouse that needed a teacher. The previous one had moved east with her husband the previous fall. The school board was desperate. The letter from Judge Hargrove carried enough weight that Rose was offered the position by post before she had fully committed to going. She arrived on January the 9th, 1884, on the morning stage from Albuquerque, stepping down into a street that was frozen at the edges and smelled of wood smoke and horse. The town was not large, perhaps 400 residents in the immediate area, with ranching families spread across the surrounding valley, but it was ordered and well-maintained in the way of a community that took pride in its own stability. She had walked directly from the stage stop to the sheriff's office because Judge Hargrove's letter had instructed her to check in with the local law before reporting to the school board. The judge had written this as a formality, she had assumed, a professional courtesy, an introduction that would smooth her arrival and forestall any awkward questions from citizens who might have heard rumors from Santa Fe. She had not expected the sheriff to be Milton Lockhart. He had been standing at the window of his office when she pushed through the door, looking out at something down the street, one hand resting on the window frame. He turned when she entered, and the first thing she noticed was that he did not look at her, The way men in authority had been looking at her for the past 3 months, with that particular combination of suspicion and pity that she had come to associate with her situation. He looked at her directly, with attention but without judgment, and waited for her to speak first. He was 31 years old, she would learn later. Tall, with the build of a man who did physical labor but was not defined by it. Dark-haired and square-jawed in a way that photographs would have done a poor job of capturing, because the most significant thing about his face was not its structure but its quality of watchfulness. His eyes were a dark hazel that changed with the light. He wore his badge with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had earned it rather than claimed it. Rose introduced herself and held out Hargrove's letter. Milton took it, read it in full. She could see his eyes moving across the text carefully, not skimming, and then placed it on his desk. "How long were you questioned in Santa Fe?" he asked. The directness of it surprised her. She had expected pleasantries. She had expected the performance of welcome. 6 days, she said. "Did they find anything that connected you directly to the transfers?" "No." "Because there was nothing to find or because you were careful?" It was the question she had been asked in several forms by several people over the past months, and she had answered it each time with a controlled precision that had served her well in the interviews. But something about the way Milton asked it, not accusing, not performing skepticism, but genuinely curious, as though he already had a hypothesis and was testing it against her response, made her answer differently than she had before. "Because there was nothing to find," she said. "I did not know what my husband was doing until the inspector came. When I understood what the forgeries were designed to do, which Apache land they were targeting, which families were being displaced, I was not just frightened, I was sick with it." Milton was quiet for a moment. Not the tactical silence of a man deciding whether to believe her, but the thoughtful pause of a man who was processing something he considered important. "The reservation boundary dispute has been going on in this territory for 15 years, he said. "A lot of people made money off it who had no business doing so. The fact that your husband was one of them does not make you one of them." Rose stared at him. "I will send a letter to Cartwright in Santa Fe to close the loop on your arrival here," Milton said, reaching for his pen. "Standard procedure for anyone coming to a new town with an active investigation associated to their recent past. It will note that you have checked in, that you are employed, and that I have no concerns regarding your presence in Sweetwater. Is that agreeable to you?" She could not immediately find words. "Mrs. Voss," he began. "Hawthorne," she said. "I have returned to my family name. I was never legally Mrs. Voss because it appears he was already married to someone in Tucson." Something moved through Milton's expression, a brief, controlled anger that was not directed at her. "Miss Hawthorne," he corrected himself without missing a beat. "Is that agreeable to you?" "Yes," she managed. "Yes, that is very agreeable to me." She left his office 10 minutes later and walked to the school board meeting feeling, for the first time in 3 months, as though the ground beneath her feet was solid. She did not let herself think too much about why Milton Lockhart's calm certainty had affected her the way it did. She was practical, and she was in a fragile position, and she was not in Sweetwater to fall in love with the sheriff. She was there to teach the children of ranchers and shopkeepers their letters and numbers, to rebuild her reputation, and to find some version of a life that did not require her to flinch every time someone said her name. The schoolhouse was a single large room at the eastern end of the main street, with 4 rows of wooden desks and a chalkboard that had been recently installed. There were 14 students enrolled at the start of the term, ranging from 6-year-old Clara Briggs, who still wrote her letters in mirror image, to 16-year-old Hector Domings, who could already read better than several adults in town, but had never been encouraged to do anything with it. Rose threw herself into the work. It was the thing she was good at, and it was also, she discovered, the thing she needed: the structure of days organized around purpose, the satisfaction of watching a child suddenly understand something that had previously been opaque, the small community of trust that formed between a teacher and her students when both sides showed up honestly. Sweetwater began, very slowly, to accept her. Not all of it. There were people, and Margaret Delacroix, the wife of the town's largest dry goods merchant, was their most visible representative, who had heard something from Santa Fe and had decided that a woman mixed up in land fraud, however peripherally, was not the kind of woman they wanted educating their children. Margaret had come to the schoolhouse in the second week to examine Rose's teaching materials, and had spent 45 minutes making comments that were designed to communicate disapproval, without being specific enough to constitute actionable complaint. Rose had thanked her for her time and interest, and had shown her the door with perfect composure, and then had sat alone in the schoolroom for 15 minutes breathing carefully until the shaking in her hands stopped. She did not see Milton Lockhart every day. The sheriff of Garnet County had a great deal of territory to cover, and he was often out of town for days at a stretch, riding circuit to the outlying ranches, or traveling to the county seat in Las Palomas to file reports and attend to territorial business. But when he was in town, she noticed him in the way you notice something that your peripheral vision keeps returning to. He noticed her too. She would catch the awareness of it occasionally, a moment when he was crossing the street and happened to glance toward the schoolhouse door just as she was coming out, and the way his pace slowed for just a beat before he touched his hat brim and continued on. She was careful not to make more of these moments than they were. She reminded herself, in no position to complicate her situation with romantic entanglement. The complications came from an entirely different direction. In the third week of March, a man named Cecil Pryor arrived in Sweetwater on the noon stage and took a room at the Garnet Hotel. Rose did not know who he was at first. She learned his name when she overheard two women discussing it outside the post office. Pryor, they said, was a former associate of a cattle operation out of Colorado that had run into legal difficulties, and he was in Sweetwater on some kind of business related to property. She registered this the way you register a distant sound that might be thunder or might be nothing, and she went about her week. It was not until a Thursday afternoon, when school had finished for the day and Rose was walking home along the back path that ran behind the livery stable, that she turned a corner and found Cecil Pryor standing in her way. He was a compact man, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that managed to convey pleasantness and menace simultaneously. He was well dressed in the manner of men who wanted to appear legitimate. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, and the fact that he knew her name told her immediately that this was not a coincidence. "Mr. Pryor," she said, because she had learned from 3 months of federal questioning that showing you know a person's name is the fastest way to establish that you are not as vulnerable as they might assume. He was not rattled. He smiled instead. "I understand you were married briefly to a man named Daniel Voss," he said. "That is a matter of public record," she said. "What is it you want?" "Daniel and I had a business arrangement that was unfortunately interrupted by his hasty departure from Santa Fe," Pryor said. "The paperwork associated with that arrangement, certain documents, certain transferred deeds exist somewhere. I have reason to believe Daniel may have shared some of that material with you before he left." Rose felt the cold clarity of understanding move through her. "He did not share anything with me," she said. "I have told this to federal investigators. I have told it under oath. I will tell it to you with the same precision. Daniel Voss did not confide in me, did not give me documents, and did not, as far as I am aware, give me any information about his activities before he disappeared. If you have a dispute about property records, I suggest you contact the land registry in Santa Fe, where, unlike your former business partner, they keep their paperwork in order." Pryor looked at her for a long moment. "You are a schoolteacher now," he said. It was not a question. It had the quality of a fact being filed. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pryor," Rose said, and walked past him. She walked the remaining 4 blocks to her rented room at the Widow Cassidy's boarding house with careful, measured steps, and as soon as the door was closed behind her, she sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands together between her knees and tried to think. Pryor was connected to Voss, which meant he was connected to the land fraud, which meant he was either here to recover something, documents, deeds, evidence, or he was here to ensure that whatever evidence existed could not be used against him. The second possibility was more dangerous than the first. She considered her options. She could write to Judge Hargrove in Santa Fe, but a letter would take time, and time might be what she did not have. She could go to the federal land office, but the nearest was in Albuquerque and Pryor would be gone, or worse, long before she could reach it. Or she could go to Milton Lockhart. She wrestled with this option with the special difficulty of a person who has spent months rebuilding her credibility and is not certain she can afford to appear to be drawing trouble toward herself again. If she walked into the sheriff's office and reported that a man connected to the land fraud had approached her in an alley, she risked reopening every question about her own involvement. She risked confirming, for those who already doubted her, that the smoke of the Santa Fe fire had followed her here. In the end, it was not strategy that decided her. It was something simpler. She trusted Milton Lockhart in a way that she could not entirely explain, and was not sure she was prepared to examine too closely. She trusted the calm directness of his questions on the first day. She trusted the letter he had written to Cartwright. She trusted the way he had said, "I have no concerns regarding your presence in Sweetwater," as though it were simply the obvious conclusion of observable evidence. She went to his office the following morning before school. He was there early, as he usually was, with a cup of coffee and a stack of correspondence that he set aside immediately when she came through the door. He listened to her account of the encounter with Pryor without interrupting, asking only two clarifying questions: whether Pryor had touched her and whether he had named any specific document or deed. The answers were no and no. "He is staying at the Garnet Hotel," Milton said when she had finished. "I know. I heard the women talking about him outside the post office before I knew who he was." Milton picked up his coffee, turned it in his hands, set it down. "He approached you in the alley behind the livery stable," he said, half to himself. "Which means he watched your pattern first. That is not casual. That is someone who came here with a specific purpose and is being careful about how he pursues it." "I was afraid of that," Rose said. "You were right to be," Milton said, meeting her eyes. "I am going to have a conversation with Mr. Pryor this morning. Not an official questioning, I have no grounds for that, but a courtesy call. The kind that lets a man know he has been noticed by the local law." Rose nodded. "And I want you to alter your route home from school for the next few days," Milton added. "Not dramatically, just slightly differently each time. And if he approaches you again, or if anything else makes you uncomfortable, you come to me directly. Not the following morning, that evening. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said. She paused at the door. "Thank you," she said, and then she left quickly because she did not trust herself to say anything more without her voice doing something she would regret. Milton's conversation with Pryor lasted approximately 20 minutes, by the account of the hotel clerk who overheard parts of it through a thin wall. Milton had been, apparently, exceedingly polite. He had expressed great interest in Pryor's business in Sweetwater, had asked several thoughtful questions about the nature of his property interests, and had mentioned, in passing, that he maintained a regular correspondence with the federal land office in Albuquerque and with the Inspector Cartwright in Santa Fe, and that he always found it professionally useful to keep those channels of communication current. Pryor checked out of the Garnet Hotel that afternoon. Rose heard about it from her student Clara Briggs, whose mother ran the hotel laundry and conveyed the news at home that evening, which Clara then delivered to the schoolroom the following morning with the breathless enthusiasm of someone sharing exciting intelligence. Rose said, "Is that so?" with appropriate calm, and redirected Clara's attention to the morning lesson. After school, she walked past the sheriff's office. Milton was at his window and saw her. He came out onto the boardwalk. "He is gone," she said. "He is," Milton confirmed. "For now." He looked at her steadily. "The fact that he left does not mean this is finished." He will look for another way to approach whatever it is he came here for. Do you think he was looking for physical documents? She asked. Things that Voss might have sent to me. It is possible, Milton said, though I think it is more likely he came to assess whether you are a loose thread, whether you know things that could connect him to the fraud. I do not know anything that could connect him specifically, Rose said. I did not even know his name before he came here. The problem, Milton said, is that he does not know what you know. And a man who has done what Pryor and Voss did to those Apache families does not leave loose threads. He said this last sentence without drama, as a statement of plain fact. I will write to Cartwright today and inform him of Pryor's presence here. That creates an official record of the contact. Rose noticed that he had said an official record of the contact, not an official record of your contact, not anything that placed her at the center of it. She noted this with a clarity that she tucked carefully away. April came and the schoolroom filled with spring light. Rose began teaching Hector Domings from an advanced grammar text she had ordered from the bookseller in Albuquerque, and Hector's face, when the book arrived, was the face of someone receiving something they had not dared ask for. She gave Clara Briggs extra time at the chalkboard each morning until the letters stopped coming out backward, and on the day they finally wrote themselves correctly across the slate, Clara turned around with an expression so purely triumphant that Rose felt it like a physical warmth in the center of her chest. She was building something here. She could feel it, the careful architecture of a life that belonged to her, constructed from her own work and her own reliability and her own presence in the world. Milton began taking his evening meals at the boarding house on Fridays. This was not an unusual arrangement. The widow Cassidy ran the best table in town and opened it to a small number of regular guests on certain evenings, but it meant that Rose sat across the table from him once a week in a domestic setting that was different from the sheriff's office and different from the brief exchanges on the boardwalk. They talked about the territory, about the children in her classroom, about the legal complications of land law in New Mexico, which Milton had studied with considerable thoroughness because property disputes were the majority of his civil casework. He asked about her father in Taos, who was still teaching at 70 and had, according to Rose, opinions about everything. She asked about his family, which turned out to be a mother in Las Palomas and a younger brother who had gone north to Colorado to work the silver mines and had not come back. "Do you hear from him?" she asked. "Letters," Milton said. "Irregular. He is not a consistent correspondent, but he is alive and apparently content, which is enough." "My father writes to me every week," Rose said. "Long letters, full of things he is reading and things he disagrees with and detailed accounts of what is growing in the school garden." "He sounds like a man who thinks carefully about the world," Milton said. "He is the person who taught me to think carefully about it," Rose said. "He always said that the most important thing you can give a child is the habit of looking at evidence before reaching a conclusion." Something in Milton's expression shifted, not dramatically, but in the subtle way that something moves when it has been reached by a different kind of light. "That is good counsel," he said quietly. She began to be aware, over those Friday evenings, that he was becoming something to her that she had not assigned a name to and was not sure she was ready to name. He was considerate without being performative about it. He was intelligent and genuinely curious, and he had the rare quality of listening to a woman speak without immediately preparing his response. He was also, she was increasingly unable to ignore, very handsome in the particular way of men who do not seem to know it, which made it considerably worse. She was 25. He was 31. She was a woman with a dark past that had been plastered onto her by someone else's choices, and was not yet certain she had successfully peeled it all away. He was the most respected lawman in the county, a man whose integrity was his professional foundation. She was extremely careful. And then in the second week of May, Daniel Voss came back. Not to Sweetwater, not initially. He was arrested in Tucson on separate charges, a fraud scheme involving false mining claims, and when the federal marshals ran his name, the Santa Fe land fraud investigation attached to it like a magnet finding iron. Inspector Cartwright wired the news to every territorial law office including Milton's, requesting information on any persons connected to the original case who were currently residing within each jurisdiction. Milton came to the schoolhouse in the late afternoon after the children had gone home and told Rose. She had been erasing the chalkboard and she stopped with her hand flat against the slate and breathed. "He is in custody in Tucson," Milton said. "Cartwright is traveling there to conduct the full interview. With Voss in custody, the investigation will reopen in full." "And my name," Rose said. "Your name has not appeared in any report I have filed in connection with this matter," Milton said. She turned away from the chalkboard and looked at him. "The prior visit," she said. "You filed a report on that." "I filed a report noting that a man named Cecil Pryor, believed to be an associate of Daniel Voss, had been observed in Sweetwater and had subsequently departed," Milton said. "The report documented his activities and my communication with him. It did not name any other Sweetwater resident in connection with his visit." Rose was very still. "Milton," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, though she was not conscious of having decided to do so. If Cartwright asks me directly whether Pryor made contact with anyone in Sweetwater, I will tell him that the contact was with me," Milton said. "Which is accurate. I was the one he left speaking with, and I was the one who documented the interaction." The precision of this, the way he had framed the truth to protect her without lying, was so exact and so deliberate that it almost made her angry, because it meant he had thought about it in advance. It meant he had made a choice, carefully and deliberately, to place himself between her and the blast radius of a situation that she had not caused. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I believed you were not involved," Milton said simply. "Including you in reports as though you would have been inaccurate." She crossed the room. She was not sure what she intended to do, and she did not reach him because she stopped herself 3 feet away, the force of her own restraint almost visible. "Pryor will tell them he spoke to me," she said, "if they ever find him." "Possibly," Milton said. "But Pryor has very strong reasons not to provide detailed accounts of his activities to federal investigators. He was an accessory to the original fraud. Speaking to you was the action of a man trying to suppress evidence, which he does not want documented. And if Voss tells them he involved me, Voss will tell them whatever he believes will reduce his sentence," Milton said. "But he has no evidence that you were involved because you were not. I have spent 4 months reviewing every document in the case file that Cartwright shared with me. There is nothing that connects you to the execution of those fraudulent transfers. Nothing. Your registry seal number was used, but the access logs show that entries were made on days when you were not scheduled to work. I noted this in my own analysis and sent it to Cartwright in February." Rose stared at him. "You sent Cartwright an analysis that supported my innocence," she said slowly. "I sent Cartwright an accurate analysis of the access logs," Milton said, "which happened to clarify the timeline in a way that was exculpatory." "How long have you been doing this?" she whispered. Milton did not look away from her. "Since the day you walked into my office," he said. "Because you told me the truth that morning, and everything I have found since has been consistent with that truth, and it seemed to me that someone ought to be on the side of accuracy." The something that Rose had been not naming for 4 months rose up in her chest with the force of a current she had not realized she was standing in. "You are a dangerous man, Milton Lockhart," she said very quietly, to someone who has spent a long time believing that no one was going to be on her side. His expression changed. It was not dramatic. It was the movement of something beneath the surface, like a river seen through ice. "You deserve to have someone on your side a great deal sooner than this," he said. The space between them held an enormous amount. Rose stepped back. She turned and picked up the erasing cloth she had set down on the desk. "I should finish closing up," she said, because she needed to move, needed to do something with her hands, and because she was 25 years old and she had been badly deceived by one man she had trusted, and the muscle memory of self-protection was very strong even when the threat was not danger but the terrifying possibility of something good. "Of course," Milton said. He put his hat on and went to the door. "Cartwright will likely want to speak with you again once the Voss interview is complete. I will let you know when I hear more." "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left, and Rose stood in the empty schoolroom in the slanted May light and pressed the erasing cloth against her chest like a compress against a wound that was, for the first time in a very long time, healing rather than deepening. The summer of 1884 moved through Sweetwater with the particular intensity of New Mexico heat days that turned the valley to gold and nights that brought a cooling wind down from the mountains and stars that spread across the sky in arrangements so dense and detailed that looking up at them felt like reading a text in a language almost within reach. The Voss investigation proceeded. Cartwright came to Sweetwater in late June, a thin, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the careful manner of someone who had been embarrassed by a previous mistake and was determined not to repeat it. He met with Rose for 2 hours in a formal interview at the sheriff's office with Milton present throughout. It was during this interview that Rose understood, fully and finally, the degree to which Milton had shaped the narrative. Not falsified it, she was clear on this, insistent on it even within her own private accounting of events. He had shaped it by choosing which accurate facts to document and which questions to pursue, steering the record toward the true picture of her role rather than the convenient one. Cartwright, she realized, had been receiving a carefully curated but entirely truthful version of the investigation for 5 months. And because the truth, when carefully presented, was a powerful thing, Cartwright had arrived in Sweetwater not as an investigator pursuing a lead, but as an official closing a file. The interview ended with Cartwright making a formal note that Rose Hawthorne of Sweetwater, New Mexico Territory, was considered cleared of all investigative interest in the matter of the fraudulent land transfers conducted by Daniel Voss between April and October of 1883. When Cartwright left the room, Rose sat very still in the hard wooden chair across from Milton's desk. "It is done," Milton said. "It is done," she agreed. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "You should know," he added in a different tone, lower, more careful, "that the 400 acres of reservation land that Voss transferred fraudulently has been restored. The territorial governor signed the restoration order in March. The families affected have been formally notified." Rose felt something inside her that had been clenched for over a year slowly begin to release. "That matters," she said. "Yes," Milton agreed. "It does." She looked at him across the desk, this man who had come into her path at a moment when she had been most alone and most stripped of the normal protections of reputation and certainty, and who had simply, steadily, without announcement or expectation of recognition, stood between her and the worst consequences of a situation she had not created. "I would like to have dinner with you," she said. "Not at the boarding house on Friday with the other residents. Properly. Just the two of us." She paused. "If that is something you would want." The thing that moved across Milton Lockhart's face in that moment, the sheriff of Garnet County, a composed and careful man who governed his expressions with professional discipline, was not subtle at all. It was warm and certain, and a little bit like something long held finally being set down. "That is very much something I would want," he said. They had dinner the following Saturday at the restaurant that had opened above the Garnet Hotel the previous winter, run by a French-trained cook named Beaumont, who had come west for reasons that were never entirely explained, and had found his clientele perfectly happy with beef, prepared with considerably more sophistication than they were accustomed to. The room was small, and the lighting was the amber of oil lamps, and Milton wore a jacket that Rose had not seen before and held her chair for her with a gravity that was not performative but simply careful. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about things that had not come up in Friday dinners with the other boarders, things that required privacy to say, that needed the space of a conversation with only one other person in it. She told him about the specific terror of the federal questioning, not the facts of it which he already knew, but the texture of sitting in a room for 6 days while strangers decided whether to believe you. He told her about the case that had defined his understanding of the law, a stock theft dispute when he was a deputy in Las Palomas that had gone badly wrong because a young man had been convicted on insufficient evidence, and the way that had settled in him like a stone he carried. Made me very careful about what I put in writing, Milton said, about what I was willing to say formally versus what was genuinely proven. That is why you are good at this work, Rose said. I hope so. He turned his coffee cup slowly. I think justice is a verb more than it is a noun. It is something you do, not something that exists passively. Rose looked at him across the table and thought that she had been, in her life, presented with two very different examples of what a man could be. The contrast was so complete that it was almost abstract, like comparing water and dry earth. I was afraid to tell you about Pryor, she said, when I came to your office that morning. I was afraid you would look at me differently. I know you were afraid, Milton said quietly. How? Because you came anyway. He held her gaze. Afraid people who come anyway are the ones I trust most. They walked home separately, in the careful way that small towns require, through the warm summer night with its orchestra of insects and distant cattle and the smell of sage that the evening wind carried down from the hills. Rose lay awake in her room at the Widow Cassidy's and thought about justice as a verb, about tending to truth the way a garden tends to things with attention, without forcing, trusting in the right conditions. She thought she might be in love with Milton Lockhart, and the thought arrived not with the anxious rush of her marriage to Voss, but with the quiet certainty of something recognized rather than invented. She let herself feel it fully for approximately 4 minutes. Then she went to sleep. Through July and August, the courtship proceeded with the deliberate pace of two people who were both, for their own overlapping reasons, committed to getting this one right. There were more proper dinners. There were Sunday afternoon rides out into the valley, where the grassland rolled in waves of gold and amber, and Milton knew the names of the hills and the seasonal patterns of the creek crossings, and pointed out the ruins of an old Pueblo settlement on a rise to the east with the quiet reverence of a man who understood that the ground he rode over had been someone's home for a very long time before it was anyone's territory. He knew the Apache families whose land had been the target of the fraud. He had met them in the course of his county work, had been treated as a trustworthy official by their representatives, and he spoke about this relationship with a directness about the ongoing injustices of territorial law that Rose found both unusual and deeply admirable in a man wearing a badge. He did not pretend that the law as written was the same as justice as understood. He worked within it as precisely as he could and pushed at its edges where he was able to. On a Saturday in late August, on the road back from the valley in the long amber evening, Milton pulled his horse to a slow stop at the top of a shallow rise and looked out at the town and its cup of hills below, the smoke from cook fires rising straight in the still air, and said, I have been thinking. About what? Rose said, her own horse coming up alongside. About whether you would marry me, he said. He was looking at the town still, and then he turned and looked at her, and his face had the quality of a man being as honest as he knew how to be. Not as a solution to anything. Not because of how things have gone this year or because I feel I owe you anything, which I do not, and I want to be clear about that, but because I think you are the most remarkable person I have come across in 31 years, and because Friday evenings are not enough, and because, he paused, and something gentler came through the contained precision of his manner, because I would very much like to spend the rest of my life in a conversation with you. Rose looked at him. The light was in his eyes and the wind from the mountains was cool, and below them Sweetwater sat in the early evening doing all its ordinary things, completely indifferent to this moment on the rise. Yes, she said. Milton, yes. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand and held it with the careful strength of someone handling something irreplaceable, and she turned her palm upward and held his hand back. And for a long, quiet moment they both looked at the town below and the sky above and the place they had each, separately and then together, come to call home. They were married in October, when the cottonwoods had gone gold along the creek and the air had the crisp authority of early autumn. The ceremony was at the church at the end of the main street, conducted by the minister, who had initially regarded Rose with the cautious reserve of a man waiting for evidence before making up his mind, and who had been making it up favorably for several months by then. The school board attended as a body, which Rose found quietly satisfying as a marker of how thoroughly she had demonstrated her value to the community. The widow Cassidy cried in the way of a woman who had been watching something develop for months and was now seeing it arrive at its proper destination. Hector Domings, who had by autumn been accepted to attend the academy in Las Palomas, with a letter of recommendation from Rose that had taken her 2 careful hours to write, stood in the second row and watched with the serious attention of a young man storing up a memory. Clara Briggs, who was 6 and incapable of sustained seriousness at important moments, dropped her flower basket 3 times and found this funnier each time, which made everyone around her quietly laugh and made the ceremony, Rose would later say, exactly right. They moved into the house that Milton had been renting on the west side of town, a proper house, not large but well built, with a front porch that caught the morning light and a back garden that Rose immediately began to plan with the precision of her father's influence and the ambition of someone who had been without a garden for too long. They planted bulbs in November in the cold ground, working side by side in the shortening afternoon, and Milton, who had not previously been a gardener, turned out to have both the patience for it and a genuine interest that surprised her, and then, when she thought about it, did not surprise her at all, because it was entirely consistent with the quality of attention he brought to everything. The letters from Taos arrived every week, and Rose's father wrote warmly and at length about Milton, whom he had met at the wedding and approved of with the thoroughness of a man whose approval was genuinely difficult to earn. He was coming to visit in the spring, he wrote. He wanted to see the school and the garden and the valley and the mountains and the general condition of his daughter's life, all of which he expected to find in excellent order, and from what he could see, it appeared that he was going to be right. Winter settled over Sweetwater. The valley turned silver gold, and the nights were cold enough to require the wood stove in the sitting room, and they developed the specific domestic intimacy of 2 people sharing a life and discovering, with a pleasure that never entirely became ordinary, that they liked the company. Milton did the reports for December at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, his papers spread across the cleared surface, his pen moving in the careful strokes of a man who writes as precisely as he speaks. Rose sat across from him reading a book, and the stove was warm and the lamp was lit against the early dark, and outside the first snow of the season was coming down in slow, deliberate flakes that settled on the porch rail and glowed in the last of the afternoon light. "Milton," she said, without looking up from her book. "Yes," he said. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I am aware of how different everything is because of how you handled those reports. Not just the formal outcome, the whole of it, the fact that I am here, the fact that the town received me the way it did, the fact that I had the room and the time to become someone Sweetwater trusted." She turned a page she had not read. "I have been wanting to say this properly for a while, and I am not sure I am doing it properly now, but I wanted you to know." The pen stopped. She looked up. Milton was watching her with the full attention that she had first noticed in his office on a January morning and had never stopped being grateful for. "You became someone Sweetwater trusted because of who you are," he said, "not because of what I wrote or did not write." "Both things can be true," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. "Both things can be true," he agreed. She went back to her book. He went back to his reports. The snow continued outside and the stove ticked warmly, and the world, which had been very large and very cold and very indifferent for a significant portion of Rose Hawthorne Lockhart's life, had contracted to this room, this table, this man, in a way that felt not like confinement but like arrival. Spring came back to Sweetwater in the particular rush that the territory always produced: sudden, vivid, insistent. The hills going green almost overnight, and the creek running high with snowmelt, and the air smelling of sage and turned earth, and the specific sweetness of things beginning again. Rose's father arrived in April as promised, a lean, bright-eyed man of 70 who got off the stage talking and did not significantly stop for 10 days. He spent 2 afternoons in the schoolroom and 3 evenings deep in conversation with Milton about territorial law, land rights, and the philosophy of evidence, and by the end of the visit had adopted Milton in the informal but absolute way of a man who recognizes a mind that operates the way he believes minds ought to operate. On the last evening of the visit, sitting on the porch in the spring dark with the stars doing their elaborate best overhead, Rose's father said to Milton, "You know what she is, don't you?" Milton looked at him. "Remarkable," he said, simply and completely. Her father nodded once, as though this was the correct answer to a very important question, and they sat together in companionable silence until the coyotes started up in the hills, and the horses in the nearby stable shifted and settled. Rose, inside doing the last of the supper clearing, heard the single word through the open window and stood for a moment with a dishcloth in her hand, and felt something warm and permanent settle into her bones. In the summer of 1885, Rose realized she was expecting their first child. She told Milton on a Tuesday morning in June before he left for the office casually, because she had decided that momentous things did not always require dramatic presentation, and watched his face go through a series of expressions in rapid succession: surprise, comprehension, something very like awe, before settling into a quiet, absolute happiness that made her own breath catch. "When?" he asked. "January, I think," she said. He reached across the breakfast table and covered her hand with his, and for a moment said nothing, which was its own kind of eloquence. "I need to go to the office," he said eventually. "I know," she said. "I will be home for supper." "I know," she said again, smiling. He stood, put on his hat, picked up his badge from the table where he left it each evening. She had never asked about this habit and he had never explained it, but she understood it as the gesture of a man who came home and was, at home, simply himself, and pinned it on at the door. "Rose," he said. She looked at him. "I am the luckiest man in Garnet County," he said. "You are the most accurate man in Garnet County," she returned, "so I will accept that assessment." He laughed, a real laugh, which with Milton was never a performance but always a response, clear and warm, and went out into the June morning. Clara Briggs, now in her 2nd year at school and writing her letters with complete reliability in the correct direction, delivered the news to the class before Rose had intended to announce it, having overheard something at her mother's laundry the previous week, and the children received it with the uninhibited enthusiasm of people who had not yet learned to contain their responses to good news. Hector Domings, who was home from the academy in Las Palomas for the summer, and had stopped by to help Rose organize the new history materials she had ordered, looked up from the stack of books with a slow grin. "The sheriff is going to be completely different about everything," he predicted with the authority of someone who had been watching adults his whole life. "He is going to be exactly the same," Rose said, "which is exactly what I am counting on." Hector considered this and nodded with the gravity of a 16-year-old who was choosing which model of adulthood to carry forward. The autumn of 1885 was one of the most beautiful that anyone in Sweetwater could remember. A long, warm, golden season that stretched well into October, the cottonwoods blazing along the creek, the sky a blue of improbable intensity, the whole valley sitting in a light that the artists who occasionally passed through on their way to more famous landscapes always stopped to photograph. Rose finished the school term in late November, handing the class to a temporary teacher named Mrs. Acaffer, who had come from Austin and was excellent, and spent the December weeks in the warm house with her books and her garden planning and her correspondence, and the increasingly pressing demands of the impending arrival. Their son was born on a Wednesday in January 1886, in the bedroom of the house on the west side of town, attended by the local doctor, and by the widow Cassidy, who had appointed herself honorary grandmother to the event, and managed the entire proceeding with the calm authority of a woman who had been present at a great many important occasions and knew how they worked. Milton, who had been allowed in the room at Rose's specific insistence, she wanted him there, she had told the doctor firmly, and that was not a matter for discussion, held his wife's hand through the final hours with the steady strength that was the central quality of his character, speaking only to say her name occasionally, quietly, in the tone that was particular to the two of them. The baby arrived in the early morning when the sky was going from black to the deep blue that precedes dawn. He was healthy and loud in his announcement of himself, and he had dark hair like his father and eyes that would take several weeks to settle on their final color. "James," Rose said, when she had held him for a few minutes and Milton had crouched beside her to look at the small perfect fact of his son. "James, for my father." "James Lockhart," Milton said, testing the sound of it. He looked at the baby with an expression that Rose could not have named but that she filed away in the private treasury of moments that make a life worth living. "That is a very good name." Dr. Renner, who was a practical man and had attended many births and had become, over the past year, a genuine admirer of both the Lockharts, confirmed that mother and son were in excellent health and left them in the first gray light of morning, with the fire burning low, and the sound of James Lockhart expressing his opinions about the world from his cradle. Milton sat on the edge of the bed beside Rose with the quiet alertness of a man who was not going to sleep, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they listened to their son. "My father is going to come immediately when we write to him," Rose said. "I have the letter half composed in my head already," Milton said. "Of course you do. It will be very accurate." She laughed softly, tired and deeply content, and he put his arm around her and they sat in the gray January morning in the warm house with the baby's intermittent commentary providing the soundtrack. And the life they had built together was not complicated in this moment, but simply, completely, and for the first time in a very long time for both of them, exactly enough. Her father arrived in February, before the roads had fully thawed, having hired a private conveyance from Albuquerque because he was not, he wrote in his advance letter, willing to wait for the regular stage schedule when there was a grandson to be met. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, swept into the house with the energy of a man who had been sustained for 3 weeks by the pure anticipatory excitement of a grandparent, and then stood in the sitting room holding James with an expression of such concentrated tenderness that Rose had to look away briefly to collect herself. He stayed for a month. He helped in the garden when the weather allowed. He had extended conversations with Milton about territorial law, education policy, Apache land rights, and the principles of judicial reform, and these conversations ranged freely across evenings in which the stove was warm and James slept in his cradle nearby, and Rose read or wrote her own letters, and felt the specific satisfaction of a household that was busy with life in the best possible sense. On the last evening of the visit, at the dinner table with James asleep upstairs and the spring night dark beyond the windows, Rose's father looked at his daughter and then at Milton and said, "I owe you a particular debt." Milton looked at him steadily. "For what you did during the investigation," he said. "I did not know the specifics until Rose wrote to me last fall and told me the whole of it, what you recorded and what you did not, the analysis you sent to Cartwright, the way you handled Pryor. He was a man who said what he meant without embellishment, which was where Rose had learned the habit. You protected my daughter when she had no one to do so, and you did it with integrity. That is a debt I cannot repay, but I want it acknowledged." The integrity of it required no sacrifice from me, Milton said. Only accuracy. That is the kind of thing a very good man says, Rose's father replied. And it is also not entirely true. We both know that. Milton was quiet for a moment. She deserved to have someone believe her, he said. She did, said her father, and you did, and I am glad. After the dishes were done and the father was retired to his room and the house was quiet, Rose stood at the kitchen window watching the last of the evening and felt Milton come to stand behind her close, his presence warm and specific and absolutely certain. He is right, you know, she said. You risked something. It was worth risking, Milton said. She turned and put both hands flat against his chest and looked at him with everything she felt visible in her face, because she had decided, sometime over the past year, that with this man she did not need to manage what she showed. I love you, she said. I want you to know that is not gratitude. It is not relief. It is not because of what you did or did not file. It is because of who you are, which is someone who makes every room more honest just by being in it. Milton's hands came up to her face, cupping her cheeks with the careful precision of a man who handles irreplaceable things gently. I know it is not gratitude, he said. I have watched you carefully for 2 years, and I know exactly what gratitude looks like from you and what love looks like from you, and they are very different things. He tilted his head slightly. You are the most honest person I have ever met, Rose, which means that when you say that, I believe it absolutely. She kissed him, and the kitchen was warm and the house was quiet, and upstairs their son slept in his cradle, and the spring night outside was full of the sounds of a world getting on with the business of living. The summer of 1886 brought several significant developments to Sweetwater that kept Milton considerably busy. There was a water rights dispute between two of the larger ranching operations in the valley that required careful legal navigation, a disagreement between the town council about the proposed expansion of the main street that generated more heated correspondence than anything since the founding of the town, and a string of small thefts at the general store that turned out, after patient investigation, to be the work of 2 teenage boys from the eastern end of the valley who were hungry because their father's crop had failed, and who were mortified and repentant when confronted, and who Milton dealt with by arranging for both families to receive practical assistance from the county relief fund. Rather than formal charges, Rose went back to teaching in September with James in the care of the widow Cassidy, who had offered this arrangement with such clear enthusiasm that refusing would have been unkind. The school now had 18 students and had outgrown its original furniture, and Rose wrote a formal proposal to the school board for expanded seating and a second window that would improve the winter light, which was approved with minimal argument because, by this point, the quality of Rose Lockhart's classroom had been sufficiently witnessed by enough parents to constitute its own argument. Cecil Pryor surfaced in a federal court in Albuquerque in October of 1886, having been arrested in connection with a separate property fraud in Arizona. The Voss case was referenced in the charges. His conviction, when it came in January 1887, was reported in the Sweetwater weekly paper in 3 concise paragraphs. Milton set the paper on the breakfast table without comment. Rose read it and put the paper down and poured herself another cup of coffee. It is finished, she said. Completely, Milton confirmed. She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked out the kitchen window at the January morning, the bare branches of the cottonwood in the back garden, the sky the pale clear blue of winter. I thought, when I was sitting in that registry office in Santa Fe being questioned for the 5th time, she said, that the best I could hope for was survival, that if I got through it and found some place to start over, I would consider myself fortunate. And now? Milton asked. She looked at him across the breakfast table, where James was methodically dismantling a piece of toast and studying the results with scientific interest, and the house was warm and the stove was burning and the day was just beginning. Now I think I misunderstood what survival could look like, she said. He smiled at her. Not the contained, professional expression she had first encountered across a desk on a January morning 3 years earlier, but the full, open smile of a man in his own kitchen with his wife and his son, a man who has come to his own particular version of a life and found it to be exactly right. "I think you understand it very well now," he said. She laughed, and James looked up from his toast with the alert interest of a child who has learned that his mother's laughter is one of the best sounds in the world, and threw a piece of crust across the table with triumphant inaccuracy. The years that followed built themselves with the satisfying solidity of things constructed from good materials. Milton was re-elected as sheriff of Garnett County in the spring of 1887, by a margin that suggested the county had no intention of releasing him from the position in any foreseeable future, which suited him well enough since he had come to understand that the work was genuinely his. Not just a job he performed, but a function that fit the particular shape of how his mind operated and what his values required of him. Rose continued teaching, and the school continued growing, and in 1888 she began advocating formally to the school board for the admission of Apache children from the reservation to the east, a proposal that was met with considerable resistance from several quarters and was not resolved in a single meeting, but in a long series of conversations that Rose conducted with the patience and precision of a woman who had learned that the most important arguments are the ones you have to make more than once. By the autumn of 1889, there were 3 Apache children in the Sweetwater school, and Rose was teaching all 18 of her students the histories of the indigenous peoples of the territory, alongside the standard curriculum, which caused Margaret Delacroix to write a letter of complaint to the school board that was read aloud at a meeting, and then set aside by a vote of 4-1. The one dissent was, naturally, Margaret Delacroix's husband. Rose received the news from the school board secretary on a Thursday afternoon, and came home to find Milton already aware of it. Word traveled fast in a town of 400, and sitting on the front porch with a look of quiet satisfaction. 4-1, he said. 4-1, she confirmed, sitting beside him. That is a decisive margin in educational philosophy. In this particular educational philosophy, yes. He handed her a glass of lemonade that he had already prepared, which she accepted with the specific gratitude of a woman who has been arguing carefully for several months, and is very tired and very content at the same time. And they sat on the porch in the September evening while inside the house James, who was 3.5 and had his father's watchful attention and his mother's direct way of speaking, conducted a complicated negotiation with the family dog about the disposition of a biscuit. Their second child arrived in March of 1890, a daughter this time, with Rose's dark hair and Milton's hazel eyes, and a temperament that the doctor described diplomatically as decisive, and that her parents described to each other in private as pure Rose in concentrated form. They named her Eleanor, for no woman in particular but for the sound of it and the quality of it, and because when they said it to her the morning of her birth she opened her eyes with an expression of such intense appraisal that it seemed to fit. James, who was 4 by then and had been solemnly briefed on the forthcoming arrival and had been, he felt, appropriately serious and responsible about the whole matter, stood beside the cradle on the second morning and looked at his sister with the same quality of focused attention he brought to everything and said, "She is very small." "She will get larger," Milton assured him. "How large?" "Considerably. Over time." James considered this with the gravity of a child processing a significant piece of information, and then reached out one careful finger and touched Eleanor's hand, and she gripped it with the involuntary strength of a newborn, and James looked up at his father with an expression of complete amazement. "She is very strong," he said. "She is going to be," Rose said from the bed, watching her son and daughter with a fullness of heart that she no longer tried to contain or manage or protect herself from, because she had learned over 6 years in Sweetwater that the things you feared to lose were worth the risk of loving. The decade turned. Sweetwater grew. The railroad that had been rumored for years finally came through in 1891, connecting the town to Albuquerque more directly, and bringing new residents and new commerce and new complications that kept the sheriff's office considerably occupied. Milton handled all of it with the same quality he had brought to every case: systematic, precise, genuinely attentive to the human specifics beneath the legal surface. James started school in the autumn of 1892 and was placed in his mother's class, which he received with the equanimity of a child who had grown up understanding that his mother was both his mother and a person of competence and authority in the world, and that these two things were not in competition. Eleanor, 2 years behind him, would follow and would be, by all early indications, considerably more disruptive in a classroom than her brother, though in the productive way of a child who asks too many questions because she actually wants to know the answers. Rose taught for 16 years in the Sweetwater School. In 1898, she was invited by the Territorial Education Office to serve on an advisory committee for curriculum reform, which she did for 3 years and which took her to Santa Fe several times, each visit a small private reckoning with the city where her life had been dismantled and from which she had rebuilt it. The rebuilding was complete, she understood, not as an achievement but as a condition. She had not simply recovered. She had built something altogether different from what had existed before, something stronger and more honest and more fully herself. And the difference was not despite everything that had happened but somehow, impossibly, because of it. On the evening before the turn of the new century, Rose and Milton sat on the front porch of the house on the west side of Sweetwater, the same house they had moved into on their wedding night in October 1884, expanded now with a proper back addition that had been added in 1892, and a porch that Milton had built himself over 2 autumn weekends with the careful craft he brought to physical work. The children were inside. James was 14, quietly reading something historical that he had ordered from a catalog. Eleanor was 12 and was almost certainly not asleep, was almost certainly doing something elaborate and undisclosed, but it was the eve of a new century and Rose had made a parental decision to be strategically unobservant. The town beyond the porch was alive with celebration voices and fiddle music and someone who had obtained fireworks from somewhere and was deploying them at intervals, each one lighting the dark sky over Sweetwater in brief, vivid arcs. 18 years, Rose said. 16 since we were married, Milton said. I was counting from when I arrived. That is a different number. Yes, she said, it is the right number. He reached across the gap between their chairs and took her hand, and she turned her palm up and held his, the gesture the same as the one on the rise above the town 16 years earlier on an August evening, when neither of them had been sure of the other and both of them had been entirely sure. Every report, Rose said softly, beginning the sentence that she had thought about many times in many forms since that afternoon in the sheriff's office when he had said it for the first time. Every one, Milton confirmed quietly. You believed me from the start. There was never a reason not to, he said. She looked at the fireworks ascending over Sweetwater, each one blooming and fading in the winter dark, and the town below them busy with the ordinary extraordinary business of a community marking time together, and the house behind them containing their children and their life and the full particular weight of everything that had been chosen and built and tended. I am going to tell James about the whole of it, she said. When he is older. The fraud, the investigation, what you did, all of it. Why? Milton asked. Because he is going to be a man who makes decisions about what to write down and what not to, she said. And I want him to understand from his own parents' story what it means to choose accuracy over convenience, what it costs and what it gives. Milton was quiet for a moment. He is going to be a very careful man, he said. He already is, Rose said. Takes after his mother, Milton said. He takes after both of us, Rose said, which was true and which they both knew. Eleanor came to the door behind them, which confirmed that she had not been asleep, and said, Can we watch the fireworks from the porch? With an expression that suggested the question was a formality. You were supposed to be asleep, Rose said. I was going to be, Eleanor said, which was almost certainly not true. Milton moved his chair to make room. Eleanor came out and sat on the step, pulling her quilt around her, and James appeared in the doorway a moment later with his book closed and his full attention available for the occasion. The four of them sat together on the porch as the last night of the 19th century moved toward its close, the fireworks spelling temporary light across the dark sky, the town of Sweetwater going about the earnest business of celebrating the passage of time, and the house behind them warm and lit, and full of everything that a house needs to be a home. Rose Lockhart, who had come to this town on a frozen January morning with a carpetbag and a secret and a letter from a judge who believed in accuracy, sat in the last night of 1899 surrounded by the life she had built from the ground of that arrival, and felt nothing missing, nothing withheld, nothing managed or protected or held at careful distance. She was home. And the man beside her, who had believed her from the very start and had written his reports accordingly, and had done it not as a favor but as a simple matter of seeing the truth and honoring it, held her hand in the dark and watched the light fill the sky and was exactly himself, steady and certain and present, the most reliable thing she had ever known. "Happy New Century," James said from his chair. "Happy New Century," Eleanor echoed from the step. "Happy New Century," Milton said and looked at Rose. "Happy New Century," Rose said, and meant it in every direction, past and present and forward, the whole unfolding road of it. The fireworks continued over Sweetwater. The fiddle music drifted up from the main street, and the Lockhart family stayed on the porch until well past midnight, four people in the warm dark, watching the century turn. Inside, on Milton's desk, was a stack of county reports, meticulously accurate, every one of them the work of a man who had never confused convenience with truth. And in the top drawer, alongside his pen and his official seal, was the letter from Judge Hargrove that Rose had brought with her on that January morning 16 years ago. The letter that Milton had kept not as a document, but as the beginning of a story, the first page of the account of the most important case he had ever worked, the one that had not gone into any report at all because some things belonged not to the county record, but to the private, irreplaceable archive of a life. The stars over New Mexico burned steady and enormous in the winter dark, the same stars that had been there for the Pueblo people on the rise to the east, and for the Apache families in the valley, and for every version of this land going back further than any written record. And under them Sweetwater slept and celebrated and moved into the future. And on a porch on the west side of town, a woman and a man sat together in the certainty of what they had built. And it was enough. It was everything. It was exactly and completely, and at last enough.